كلية الفقه الحنفي تقدم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن والاه أما بعد. In the previous lesson, we covered a lot of rulings relating to the guardian in marriage. In today's lesson, we'll be mainly focusing on suitability in marriage. The first ruling will be a continuation of the previous lesson where we discussed a guardian who is alive but absent and is in a disconnected absence. For example, they are in a coma. Then we said that the next immediate guardian is allowed to marry the woman off. But we hadn't yet discussed what disconnected absence means. So in this lesson, inshallah, we'll be discussing what we mean by disconnected absence or ghaibah munqati'ah. And then we'll be moving on to suitability. And we will learn that suitability is something that is important and must be taken into account when couples get married. And we learn that if the woman who gets married without her guardian's consent, if she decides to get married to someone and that person, the man, is of a lower standing to her, then in that case, because she will be causing some harm and ruining her family's reputation, and we'll discuss all of that in detail, inshallah, because of this, her guardians are allowed to separate between the two. You'll also be learning what factors are taken into account when it comes to determining suitability. For example, wealth or occupation. So these are factors when it comes to determining whether there is suitability between husband and wife. We'll then be moving on to a woman who gets married, and she gets married without her guardian's consent, and she decides to reduce the dowry from the customary dowry of her family. So we'll discuss the ruling in relation to that, and essentially her guardians can object to this. We'll also be learning the ruling of a father who decides to marry their minor off, and when it comes to the case of a woman, if he increases or if he decreases rather from the customary dowry, he is allowed to do this. And similarly, when it comes to increasing from the minor's dowry, then he is also allowed to do this, and certain rulings relating to that, inshallah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the ability. Ameen. So far, we've understood the basic ruling that's been mentioned about if the closer guardian is absent, then the next immediate guardian can marry the woman off. So that would be the guardian in her marriage. Now, what hasn't been discussed yet is what does he mean by disconnected absence? So Imam Quduri rahmatullahi alayhi discusses that in this passage. He says, disconnected absence is when one is in a city which convoys do not reach except only once a year. So that's how far it is. So in terms of a person being physically far, so far that convoys only reach there once a year. So due to its distance, people reach there only once a year. Now, how does that apply, practically? Essentially, disconnected absence is when a person cannot be accessed. Now, the scholars have a few views in this regard. One view is that this is such a distance that is basically the distance of travel. So if her closest guardian is so far that if she traveled there, she would become a traveler, a musafir, a shari'i musafir, which means that the rulings of a traveler would apply to her. For example, she would need to pray 2 rak'ahs of salah rather than 4 rak'ahs of salah. She would, all the rulings of traveling would apply to her. So that is one view. The scholars say that the equivalent in this day and age is 48 miles, and there are various views on that as well. But this is one view, that it is the distance that a person becomes a musafir, a traveler. Another view is that it's according to months. And according to the correct view in this regard is 3 months. Another view is that it is a few months. So if the guardian is so far that it would take a few months to go there, then in that case, the next guardian can marry her off. So these are two views so far. And some scholars have said that the correct opinion is 3 days and 3 nights, where in those days it would take a person 3 days and 3 nights, and then they would be considered, if they travel such a distance, they would be considered a musafir, a traveler. Okay, so some scholars have given preponderance to this view. But there are other scholars who said that no, the preponderant view is another one. And that is where if the guardian is so far or is so inaccessible that if they were to get to him, by the time they get to him, then what would happen is this potential match, this suitable spouse, yes, this potential husband would be lost. So her family really wants her to get married to that man, but the immediate guardian is absent. So how long will it take for him to come back? If it's going to take longer than the time that this potential spouse may be lost, then this can move on. The guardianship can move on to the next person. But if he is expected to come in less than that, then they must wait for him to give that consent to her. Then the family must wait for him, and only he can get her married off. Okay, so we said that this is the preponderant view, but the scholars said that not only that, but it's also the more practical view. So how does it work? Let's give an example. Aisha, she wishes to get married, and her family or she herself has found a very suitable spouse, and they don't want to lose this man, and the family really want her to get married to him. Her father, let's say she hasn't got a son, which means that because the son is the immediate guardian, but she hasn't got a son. Her father is her immediate guardian, but her father, let's say Ali, yes, he is in a coma. Now, how long will he recover from a coma? Nobody knows. In that case, she doesn't have to wait for him to recover from the coma. She can go to her next guardian. Let's say it's her brother. Let's give another example. Let's say her father is in a coma, but she has a grandfather alive. Now, the grandfather, let's say, is in i'tikaf. Now, in i'tikaf, he may not have his phone. She can't really access him. So, and if she waits for the entire month, because he's gone for an entire month of i'tikaf, then if she waits for that, then she may lose the spouse. And in that case, she can wait, she can get married off by the next guardian. So we understand from this that it's not a certain duration, it's not really a specific time, rather it depends on how long a person can wait till that spouse may potentially be lost. So it could be 1 month, it could be 2 months. It just depends on the circumstance. So this is the preponderant view, and this is what is meant by disconnected absence. Imam Quduri rahmatullahi alayh is talking about physical absence. But as we said, all you need is that guardian's consent. So this can be done, especially in this day and age. It can be done over the phone, over a Zoom meeting, or over a text message. Yes, but we gave the example of a person being in a coma. Of course, a person cannot really be accessed if they're in a coma, or in i'tikaf when the person hasn't got his phone. So it doesn't mean, yes, Imam Quduri rahmatullahi alayh is addressing, of course, in his time when there was no phone or there was no Zoom meeting, a person couldn't really be accessed remotely. But in this day and age, this can happen even if a person is really far away. And as we said, the practical view and the preponderant view is that person cannot be accessed until the uh, the the potential spouse will be lost. And in that case, the next guardian can be consulted in this regard. So this is the discussion of guardian in marriage. And now we've come to the end of this discussion. And before we move on to the next topic, which is the topic on suitability in marriage, I just want to highlight the importance of guardian again and discuss what we basically addressed in this topic, because It's a very short topic, but it is of great importance. We said that a guardian in marriage is needed. When it comes to a minor in marriage, a minor cannot get married without their guardian's consent. And when it comes to a Muslim woman who wishes to get married, we said that she should get married. This is different to a minor. When a Muslim woman gets married, then she should get married with her guardian's consent. But if she happens to get married without their consent, then strictly speaking, the marriage will be valid. We also showed that the father and grandfather are different from other guardians when it comes to marrying minors off. So let's say the brother married off this minor. So the minor, as soon as they hit puberty, whether it's a boy or a girl, we said that as soon as they hit puberty, they have the automatic right to annul the marriage. When it comes to the father or grandfather, because they are closer to this minor, they have a certain level of awareness, a really high level of awareness when it comes to knowing what the best interest, looking for the best interest of that minor, and also a very, very high level of compassion. Because of these two things combined, they are if they married off this minor, as soon as the minor hits puberty, they would not have the same right. The minor would not have the same right to annul the marriage. So this is another important point we learned in this discussion on guardians in marriage. We also learned that there are certain types of people who cannot be a Muslim woman's guardian in her marriage. For example, a minor child, yes, even though the child may be a boy, a male relative, but because of the boy being minor, not having passed puberty, the boy cannot be a Muslim woman's guardian in her marriage. We also said a kafir, a disbeliever, cannot be a woman's guardian in her marriage. Even though he may be her brother or her father. But despite this, because he is a disbeliever, he cannot be her guardian in her marriage. And we also learned that in certain cases, it could be that a Muslim woman does not have a guardian. And what does she do in her case? In that case, what does she do? We said that that's not the end of the world. She still can find a guardian, or she still can have somebody who can act as her guardian. They won't be her male relatives if she has no male relatives, but we said that in this day and age, let's say somebody of some authority who has some authority in that region, in that locality, they can carry out her marriage and they can marry her off like an imam in the locality, imam of the masjid. Because of course we don't have in the absence of a Muslim governance, Muslim ruler or a judge, this could be one possible solution, that she approaches an imam to conduct her marriage and marry her off. Now we are moving off from the discussion of guardians in marriage, and we are now starting the topic of suitability in marriage. What is suitability? Why is it so important? And various rulings relating to its importance will be addressed in this discussion, inshallah. So, firstly, the Prophet ﷺ, as reported in Sunan at-Tirmidhi, he says that three things should not be delayed when they arrive. One is prayer. It should be prayed. It should be performed at its appointed time. Another is janaza, or the funeral. When it arrives, then it should not be delayed. And the third thing the Prophet ﷺ says, when a woman's match, a suitable match arrives, then that should not be delayed. So the Prophet ﷺ is saying that a woman, when her suitable spouse, when a potential spouse is suitable, then there should not be delay in marriage. Women should be married off only by their guardians, and their marriage should take place only with suitable matches. So this is the importance we find in the hadith regarding suitability in marriage. And coming to the purpose of suitability, the purpose is not to discriminate between certain people, that a person of high family background can consider somebody else's family low and inferior. That is not the purpose of this. Rather, as we know, the criteria for who is superior and who is inferior is only one, and that is taqwa and God consciousness. So taqwa is the only thing that determines whether a person is superior or inferior. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who is the judge of this criteria. But when it comes to suitability, the purpose of this is to increase the chances of making a marriage successful and blessed. So if there is more suitability among the spouses, then there is a higher chance that the marriage itself will be successful and there would be more barakah and blessings in that marriage. Imam Quduri rahimahullah ta'ala says, suitability in marriage is to be taken into account. Thus, if a woman marries someone without equal status to her, the guardians may seek separation between the two. Now, as we can see, this is a ruling wherein the guardians have a right to do this. They don't have to do this, but if they wish, if they feel the need to protect their family's honor, they can do this. Now, one important point to note here is that this ruling applies in a scenario where they have not yet had a child. If they did have a child, then the guardians would not be permitted to separate them. Of course, in such a case, the harm would be greater than the benefit of protecting the family's honor. Another point to note is that if she had got married to someone in such a way with the permission of a guardian, then later on the guardians cannot separate them to protect their honor. Similar is the case where one of the guardians marry her off to someone who is not of equal standing. Then later on, none of the other guardians can separate the two. So now we've understood the importance of suitability in marriage and the fact that the guardians have such a privilege or such a right if she does get herself married off in such a way. Of course, if she marries herself off to someone who is of higher standing than her, the guardians wouldn't need to protect their family's honor. In the next passage, we learn what factors influence suitability. So Imam Quduri rahmatullahi alayhi says, suitability is taken into account with regards to lineage, religiosity, and wealth. That is, that he possesses the dowry and financial maintenance, and it is also taken into account with regards to occupations. The first thing Imam Quduri mentions with regards to suitability is lineage. Lineage is something people feel very strongly about. Let's say, for example, a woman is known to be among the descendants of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when she decides to get married, she should be looking for somebody of a similar lineage. And by doing so, she would be protecting the honor of her family. Especially in those days, they felt very strongly about this. So Quraysh would only get married to others from Quraysh. Arab women would only get married to Arab men, and etc. So these are things that there were very strong sentiments regarding these things. And so lineage is something which should be taken into account. And then he mentions religiosity. So let's say there was a significant difference between the woman and the man she marries. And the man she marries is not as religious as her family. So what the guardians can do is they have the right to separate the two. And then he mentions mal, wealth. So there are two things in regards to this. A person, the man, he has the ability to give her the dowry and also financial maintenance. So what kind of dowry? Dowry, which is basically whatever that her family had received. And we'll come to the discussion of what the customary dowry or the dowry that her side of the family usually receive. If she gets married to him, that is, and the dowry that is stipulated is lower than their customary dowry, then the ruling applies that the guardians can separate the two. Similarly, financial maintenance. Let's say the man is unable to provide her something which is basically considered a necessity in her family. Let's take the example of a washing machine. her family are used to using a washing machine to wash their clothes, a tumble dryer, but to dry the clothes. But he is unable to financially provide a washing machine, a tumble dryer to wash and dry the clothes. So if he is unable to do these things, this would mean that he is unable to financially provide for her. Um, and so he would not be considered suitable for her in relation to wealth. They would not be on equal standing. So this is also taken into account, a person's wealth. And finally, he mentions about occupations. So nobility of the occupation and sources of financial income, these are things that people feel very strongly about. So that's something that is a factor to take into consideration with regards to suitability in marriage. And so let's take an example of a woman who decides to get herself married off. Now, her father, for example, is a doctor and her brother is a dentist, etc. When she gets herself married off, she marries somebody who is a cleaner. Now, generally speaking, in society, a cleaner is not seen to be of doing a noble job, or a cleaning job is not seen to be something of that is a noble occupation. And so the guardians, if they wish, they can seek separation between the two because, of course, this will be a means of dishonor to her family. Now, this doesn't mean that it's always the case. If they don't feel that this is any form of dishonor, they don't have to seek separation. And hence the ruling is such that the guardians can separate between them. As we mentioned earlier, this is a right of the guardians if they feel the need to protect their family's honor. It's not something that they must do as soon as they hear that this is the case. But if they feel they need to do this, they have the right to do so. Of course, in a case where the woman has gotten married to somebody of lower standing to her and her family, and they've been married for a while, and the guardians don't know about this marriage, and let's say they've had a child now. Now, if they've had a child, we've mentioned earlier that the guardians no longer have this right. They should be left in that marriage, and the guardians have no right to object to this marriage. So this is another important point to mention. And these, so far, we've discussed the basics of suitability. Okay. When a woman marries and she reduces something from the customary dowry, then the guardians may oppose her, according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, until the customary dowry is given to her complete, or the husband is separated from her. So now this is the first time in the chapter on marriage that the term customary dowry is being introduced to us. So I'm going to elaborate firstly on this customary dowry, or mahrul mithl in Arabic. This is an amount received by other women of similar character and social standing on the paternal side of her family. So we would be looking at the paternal side only, not the maternal side. So we'd be looking at the paternal aunt, not her maternal aunt. We'd look at her sister because her sister is also from the father's side. Let's say the sister received £1,000. The paternal aunt also received around £1,000 when she got married. So this would become a general default sum in her family. The mahrul mithl, the customary dowry in her case, would be £1,000. Another factor to be looked at when considering these women on her father's side is similar character and social standing. So these women, for example, are similar in beauty, education, etc. Let's say, for example, her education level is significantly higher than these women, her paternal aunt and her sister. So they may have received £1,000, but that wouldn't be her customary dowry. Rather, we would have to look at other women on her father's side who are more educated, similar to her, and only then can we identify and determine what the customary dowry for her would be.
Now, coming back to the text, Imam Quduri rahimahullah ta'ala is saying that a woman who has married herself off without her guardian's consent, and what she does here is that she decides to accept such a dowry which is below the customary dowry of her family. Now, the guardians, if they feel, they can object and say that you have to give her at least the customary dowry, or we will separate you. Now, remember, why is this the case? Because, of course, giving anything below the customary dowry will be a means of dishonor to the family. Now, of course, if the guardians had been the ones who had given consent to this marriage, then that would have been okay. But this is not the case. And then he says, when a father gives his minor daughter in marriage and he reduces something from the customary dowry, or he marries off his minor son, and that son increases the amount in the dowry of his wife, then that is permitted for both of them. That is not allowed for anyone other than the father and grandfather. So this is a case where a father is marrying off his minor children and he seemingly incurs harm or at least financial loss towards them. So in the case of marrying of his minor daughter, he is accepting such dowry which is below the customary dowry of his family. And in the case of marrying of his minor son, he is making his son give more than the customary dowry. Now, is this acceptable? Yes, that is valid, and they would have to accept this. And in the case of his son, he would have to give this much. This is also valid and acceptable when the grandfather does this for their grandson or the granddaughter in their marriages. This is not acceptable for anybody else besides the father and grandfather. Any other guardian cannot do the same thing. We've mentioned previously that the father and grandfather are different from the other guardians. And the reason for this, as we said earlier, was that their level of compassion, number one, and their great awareness of what is best for these minors. These two things, they are different when it compared to other guardians. And so they can do this and other guardians cannot do this. Okay. In the next one, Imam Quduri discusses whether the dowry must be mentioned in the marriage contract. So he says, the marriage contract is valid when the dowry is mentioned in it. And it is also valid even if the dowry is not mentioned in it. So as you can see, the dowry does not need to be stipulated in the marriage contract itself, i.e. the marriage will be valid even without mentioning what dowry will be given. So, of course, if the dowry is not mentioned, it doesn't mean that he would not be required to give it to her. As we learn later on, he will be required to give her the dowry afterwards. And if he hasn't mentioned it in the marriage contract, then what would be due on him would be the customary dowry, the mahrul mithl, if he had consummated the marriage. That's something we're going to be learning later, inshallah. But the basic point to understand here is that if in the marriage contract the dowry has not been mentioned, still the marriage will be valid. Now we are moving on to the detailed rulings of dowry. So we mentioned about suitability and its importance. And we only touched on the fact that dowry is not a condition to be mentioned in the marriage contract itself. And now we've come to what dowry itself is and what's the minimum, etc. So Imam Quduri says, the minimum amount of dowry is 10 dirhams. So if someone specifies less than 10 dirhams, then she has 10 dirhams. So firstly, 10 dirhams is equivalent to approximately 30.618 grams of silver. And Imam Quduri says that the minimum is this amount. If somebody happens to say something below this amount, somebody says, I'm going to give you 5 dirhams in dowry, then that would be invalid. The marriage contract will not be invalidated, but that would not be an invalid amount. And automatically, what would be due on him would be 10 dirhams. That is because nobody is allowed to give, or dowry itself cannot be less than 10 dirhams. In the following passages, Imam Quduri rahmatullahi alayh mentions a lot of detail and various scenarios of when a person specifies the dowry, and if they don't specify the dowry, and if the marriage is consummated, how much to give in that case, if it's not consummated, how much to give in that case, or if the person dies and leaves her as a widow, then how much to give in that scenario. So various scenarios, inshallah, we'll be first covering the text, explaining the text, and then giving a summary, inshallah. And I'll also be providing a diagram to help ease the understanding, inshallah. He says, whoever specifies the dowry as 10 dirhams or more, then whatever has been mentioned is due upon him if he consummates the marriage, or if he dies, leaving her as his widow. If, however, he divorces her prior to the consummation of the marriage, or before seclusion with her, then she is entitled to a half of what was mentioned as dowry. So this is the case of specifying the dowry in the marriage contract. There's going to come a scenario where he hasn't specified the dowry. But here, what he does is he specifies the dowry as 10 dirhams or more. Then if he consummates the marriage, or if he dies and she has become a widow now, then what would be due on him is the entire amount that he had specified. However, if he divorces her prior to consummating the marriage, or before seclusion itself, and we're going to be discussing what seclusion is, inshallah. So in this case, before consummation of the marriage and before seclusion, what's going to be due on him is half of what was stipulated in the marriage contract. So these are two scenarios so far. Either he's going to be giving her the full dowry or half of the dowry. The full dowry will be due when he consummates the marriage, or if he dies, leaving her as the widow. And half of the dowry would be due if he has not consummated the marriage and he has not even had a chance to be in seclusion with her. So these are two scenarios. Again, the discussion of seclusion and its details will be explained later, inshallah. But the basics that should be understood now is that it refers in this context to the husband and wife being together without the presence of anyone else. And neither of the two are prevented from having intimate relations with the other. So even if they have not had intimate relations with the other, but there is no prevention, so that is considered seclusion here.
And now to summarize all that we learned in today's lesson. We started the discussion off by saying what ghaibah munqati'ah, or disconnected absence, is. And then we moved on to the topic of suitability in marriage. We said that suitability is something that is very important and must be taken into account when getting married. And it's so important that if a woman decides to get married without her guardian's consent to somebody who is of lower standing to her, then because that will cause harm to her family and ruin their reputation, her guardians are allowed to, if they wish, they can cause a separation between the husband and wife. And we also discussed what factors are taken into account when it comes to suitability, such as lineage, religiosity, wealth and occupation, etc. We also discussed the ruling of a woman who gets married without her guardian's consent, and she decides to take less than the customary dowry. Then in that case, her guardians can object and cause a separation between the two until the husband gives at least the customary dowry. And then we mentioned the ruling of a father who marries his daughter off. He is allowed to reduce the dowry below the customary dowry. And similarly, the minor son, he is allowed to increase the dowry from the customary dowry of his family. And even if this is basically a potential harm towards his child, he is allowed to do this. And we said that the grandfather can also do this. And nobody besides the father or grandfather can do this. We then mentioned that the marriage contract is still valid even if the dowry is not stipulated within the marriage contract. We also mentioned the minimum amount of dowry. And we said that if anybody mentions anything below the minimum amount of dowry, then they will receive the minimum amount of dowries. We also said that there are various cases, various scenarios when a person stipulates or a person doesn't stipulate the dowry, how much will result when it comes to how much will the woman receive. We discussed that as well. We mentioned one scenario when the man, when they have agreed to a specified dowry. We mentioned that scenario.